Another year, another epic collapse for the Toronto Maple Leafs. After nearly completing a comeback against the Boston Bruins after being down 3-1 in their series, they lose in overtime of Game 7 off a David Pastrnak goal. And this leaves a lot of questions for not only the Leafs organization, but for their fan base as well. Welcome back to the channel. I don't know if you guys tuned into last night's game, but it was one for the ages, and another game where Toronto just continues to lose to Boston in the playoffs. Now, if you're a Toronto fan, there's a lot of positives to take away from this game, but also a bunch of negatives as well. And as somebody who's a Bruins fan, I'm going to try to stay as unbiased as I can. I even put on my Leafs jersey today just to let you guys know that I feel for this organization and the team and feel like they deserved a lot better from this series. So today we're going to break down the future of the Toronto Maple Leafs and what a Game 7 loss against their division rival means for this organization's future. So before we talk about the future of the Maple Leafs, I kind of just want to break down the series and where I think things went wrong for Toronto. Now, a lot of people might be saying, well, Game 7 was the only game. They could have won that. It was basically just who's going to get the goal. But I think if you look back at games 1 through 4, Toronto needed to steal more than just one game. Imagine this series is tied 2-2 and say you get Game 5, you're heading down to Toronto with the 3-2 series lead rather than continuing to be down 3-2. I think a big thing people are overlooking here is that they didn't play well to start the series, and with a Boston roster that's clearly lacking talent compared to yours, that's how you win a series like this. You don't give a team like the Bruins life or a chance to win a series at home at Game 7 when history shows they show up all of the time and you don't. Now let's just take a look at the Leafs roster and talk about where things went right and where things went wrong. And let's start with their offense. 3 guys who I think are very important to this offense moving forward: Austin Matthews, William Nylander, and Max Domi. Now, the Leafs need to re-sign Domi. I believe he led the team in points that entire series. He was a dog on the faceoff. He added a ton of grit to this team and just fits in perfectly with their system. I was surprised with this game. I knew Domi was good, but I didn't think he had that in him. I would bring Domi back easily, sign him to a 3-4 year extension, and let him keep playing with Matthews. Clearly, they have some kind of connection, and I think that that's just a necessary move for the Toronto Maple Leafs to make. As for Austin Matthews, I think he was pretty good in this series. I think you can chirp a lot of people on this Leafs roster, but he showed up in every game that he played in, even in Game 7 with that beautiful assist to William Nylander to get the Leafs on the board. Obviously, Matthews isn't going anywhere. He had a fantastic season, almost having his 70 goals. He's really not the problem for this Leafs offense. And the last guy who I think was an all-star in this series when he played was William Nylander. Nylander in Game 6, 2 goals to get them back in the series, tying it up, and then in Game 7 getting the only goal for the Leafs. And after signing that big ticket, it's pretty clear that Nylander isn't going anywhere for Toronto. So those were the 3 guys that really stood out to me with their offense. And a couple guys who I feel like could have done more, even though they did have an impact in other ways: Mitch Marner, John Tavares. Now, you guys can keep saying, well, in Game 5, Tavares, he helped win the overtime thing. Yeah, I get that, but that's what he should be doing. He's making $11 million, and I think he should be doing that on a night-in, night-out basis. We talk about Jim Montgomery calling out David Pastrnak. Where's Sheldon Keefe calling out John Tavares or calling out Mitch Marner? We have to hear that from Biz on TNT, not from their head coach, which I think a lot of people overlooked when we were talking about this series. And I think one of those 2 guys is going to be out of the locker room next season. I can't imagine it's going to be John Tavares. That's pretty much an immovable contract, and I think this is his last year anyway, so you're going to get that off the books and maybe sign him to a lower deal. But when it comes to Mitch Marner, he's up for a contract soon, and I just don't see any way that the Maple Leafs bring him back. It's no knock on Marner. I think he's a great player, but I think you can't keep going in every season with 4 guys making over $10 or $11 million and say, hey, this is the recipe for success when you've seen no success over the past 7 years or so. I imagine that Mitch Marner is going to be traded for some kind of high-end defenseman. I think that's what the Maple Leafs need, and if they don't do that, they're basically just asking for the same recipe every season, being knocked out in the first or second round. Which kind of leads me to the defense of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I was actually very impressed by this team in the second half of this series. Now, from game 1 through 4, I think they looked terrible. It looked like they were lacking a puck-moving defenseman, which I think is a key to any successful playoff team. But if you look at games 5 through 7, I think they were very, very solid. They controlled the neutral zone. They kept Boston out of their own end for the most part, even though game 7 was kind of split between the two teams. But if you look at game 5 and 6, Boston was held to 3 shots in the the first 2 periods of those 2 games, which is just insane when you think about it. So I think Morgan Rielly, clearly he was a nice player in this series. I don't think he's a number 1 defenseman. I think he's like a 1B defenseman on any Stanley Cup winning team. I think Lyubushkin was nice. I think Liljegren was pretty solid for the Leafs for the most part. Had a few sloppy plays here and there, but I think he was pretty good. And then the last guy who I actually think was a lot better than anyone expected was Edmondson. He was out there being physical, laying the body, getting the puck out. Sure, he's not this high caliber defenseman, but I think he was a nice add for the Maple Leafs. I think if you're Toronto, a big thing you need to focus on is taking one of those all-star forwards like Mitch Marner, trading him out, getting yourself a puck-moving defenseman, sort of like a Charlie McAvoy, and start building around that. Get your defense right, and the offense will carry with that. And the last positive thing you could probably take away from this Leafs team is that they finally have a young goalie who they can build around in the future in Joseph Woll. I think we all can say that Ilya Samsonov played great in Game 7, but that was probably his last game in a Leafs uniform. Given the fact that Joseph Woll carried them in Game 5 and 6, keeping them pretty much off the scoreboard entirely, I think he should have the starting job next year easily. There is no reason for them to be playing this back and forth with Samsonov and Woll. If you want to bring Sammy back to play that backup role or tandem role, I think that's fine. But I think moving forward, Leafs fans will be happy with Joseph Woll in net. I think he has a lot of promise and shows up in big games, which is a quality the Leafs have lacked for the past decade or so. And the last thing I just want to bring up is the coaching. I think it's safe to say that Toronto needs to get rid of Sheldon Keefe. I talked earlier about how Jim Montgomery was calling out his star players, and Sheldon Keefe's just kind of standing behind the bench, looking unfazed by the game, like he's just happy to be there, which, I mean, that's great and all, but you have a talented roster that should be going past the first round this year, and you're already sent home again in a Game 7. I think the Leafs need to move on from him and get themselves a Bruce Cassidy style coach, someone who's going to be a little bit harder on the players and get the most out of them the way that Cassidy does and the way that guys like Montgomery do. You can have regular season success, but when it comes to the playoffs, it's a different beast, and it looks like he's just not getting the best out of his guys. But this is the future of the Maple Leafs. I want to know what you guys think. Where do you think they need to improve on? I think it's about time that they move on from one of the core 4 and get themselves a solid defenseman, and most likely move on from Sheldon Keefe. And I think that maybe we could see a few more positive things coming from the Leafs next year. I also think that it's important for them to move on from guys like Tyler Bertuzzi and keep guys like Max Domi. I think that that's the direction they need to head in. But let me know what you guys think. Comment what you thought about this series and who you think is going to win in the Boston versus Florida series. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content. I'll see you guys in the next one.